The U.S. is looking to counter Chinese dominance in critical minerals by getting allies to join a preferential trading zone. Allies who sign on would benefit from minimum price guarantees. Now, that was all discussed at a meeting with ministers from 50 countries today, invited to Washington by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio to discuss critical minerals. Now, some countries walked away with a signed action plan to deepen collaboration with the U.S. The EU and Japan have signed on to one such deal together. Mexico has signed on to a similar deal. But Canada, it is leaving with no new action plan with the United States. To talk about all of that, we're joined now by Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand. She is in Washington, D.C., and she attended the critical minerals meeting there today. Minister, it is good to see you. I know you got a busy travel schedule, so we appreciate the time.
Good to be here.
Help us understand why there is no agreement coming out of this between Canada and the United States when key allies like Europe, Japan, and Mexico seem to have reached some sort of an understanding.
Well, to begin, David, Canada's only signing deals that are favorable to our economic and our national security interests. We're not looking to sign sector by sector deals, and we are looking forward to the comprehensive CUSMA review. We do need to understand the composition of what the U.S. is putting on the table, recognizing that at the G7, the Prime Minister led a G7 initiative on critical minerals, a buyer's club, if you will, and 26 deals were signed in October, led by Minister Hodgson last year. So there's work to do. We are collaborative. We're at the table with over 50 countries today to ensure that we're stabilizing the supply chains for critical minerals together. But at the same time, we need to make sure that any deal is in Canada's interest. And there are specific aspects of the U.S. initiative, particularly the price floor, that we need to understand better. So again, it's in Canada's interest to make sure that we maximize the returns to our country, and that's our position going into these meetings. I'll say after my intervention today, numerous countries came to me and thanked Canada for our leadership on the world stage, including in the area of critical mineral supply chains.
Right. I do remember there was an acute focus on critical minerals at the G7 in Alberta, and I know Minister Champagne was in Washington just a few weeks ago as the G7 finance ministers and equivalents talked about this very thing. So based on the way you've described this, is it no CUSMA, no critical minerals? Like, are you putting all of that together? Because giving the U.S. what they want on this important issue, it does take away some of the leverage on the broader conversation. Am I understanding it correctly there?
Well, I think we do need to take a step back, David, and understand what the United States was putting on the table together today. First of all, of the three parts on the table is the FORGE, or the Forum on Resource Geostrategic Engagement. And that's a rebranded and restructured initiative from the Biden era, which looks for greater global cooperation on critical minerals. Canada is participating in that very intensely, making sure that we are collaborative as a producer country ourselves. Our expertise is needed and recognized. Second is the ATCM, or the work on trade for critical minerals. This is where the price floor mechanism is being introduced, and that is something that certainly Canada wants to understand and ensure that we're getting the best deal possible for Canada if we continue to go down that route. And then thirdly, and these are the agreements that you seem to be mentioning in your question, some countries are signing bilateral MOUs with the United States on critical minerals. Again, they are bespoke agreements with the United States, and Canada is looking forward for the comprehensive negotiations or review of the CUSMA. That's our goal, and we will work to make sure that Canada's interests in the economy, in national security, are maximized at every turn.
Right. But I don't want to misstate or misunderstand what you're saying there, but it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Minister, that there's not really an appetite for a bespoke deal on critical minerals until the larger trade issues are dealt with, right? Because when the president's hitting steel, auto, you name it, what is the value, I suppose, in giving him something that he's looking for right now in this? Am I understanding that correctly? Until there's a movement and improvement on trade overall, then a side deal like this is not an option.
We're not putting it conditionally in the way you say it, but the point is that our economies are very integrated and much more so than any other country that was around the table today. Therefore, we do need, in the interests of the Canadian economy and indeed the deal that was struck in 2018, to see a review of that broader relationship, which is being led by Minister LeBlanc, and indeed that sees a cross-the-board examination of the economic advantages to Canada as being central to that review.
So in terms of the minimum price or the preferential price, whatever the precise term is that the U.S. is floating, I know there have been some in the mining sector here in Canada who think the idea of that kind of price certainty is a good thing in and of itself, that it would give them the certainty they need to make the projections and then commit the capital to go through the timeline to try to accelerate mineral development. What are your thoughts on that? I know you say you need to get more information on what exactly the U.S. is putting on the table, but is that as a concept that Canada is open to exploring?
The leadership that the Prime Minister offered with the G7 counterparts last year in Kananaskis is indicative of the point that we strongly support stabilized supply chains in critical minerals for the reasons you stated, and indeed are leaders in that area. I referenced those 26 deals that were struck back in October as a result of the Buyers Club that Canada is leading on. The initiative by the United States is another layer on top of the initiative that Canada has already put forward through the G7, contains complex concepts like a price floor, like a right of first refusal. And before we sign on to that particular aspect of the US package, we really need to understand what is being put forward, but also we're driving towards the review of the CUSMA being led by Minister LeBlanc.
Okay, this is your first trip, I believe, to Washington, D.C. since the Davos speech by the Prime Minister and sort of the pushback that we saw from U.S. officials. Are you sensing any backlash or pushback as a result of the Prime Minister's speech now that you're there at an event hosted by Secretary of State Rubio?
Canada was invited to participate today, and Secretary Rubio and I had a very good conversation, agreed to pick that up next week when we meet at the Munich Security Conference. And so the relationship bilaterally and certainly multilaterally remains strong. As I have said numerous times, Secretary Rubio and I have cooperated and collaborated on several issues: Ukraine, the Middle East, Haiti, and beyond. And so the work on critical minerals that we were discussing today is part and parcel of the strong bilateral relationship that we share and that we continue to build.
But no pushback, I mean, about easing of tariffs and resolving some trade irritants with China. This has certainly caught the attention of certainly the media ecosystem in the United States that is more aligned with President Trump. And certainly you saw what his Treasury Secretary has been saying on a range of issues over the last number of days. Has it come up in any of the conversations with Secretary Rubio, other U.S. officials at this meeting, that this is a meaningful irritant for the U.S.?
Certainly, the reasons for instability in critical mineral supply chains were part and parcel of the conversation today. At the same time, I made sure to clarify that the visit to China was to resolve trade irritants, trade frictions in the relationship in order to allow, for example, canola and seafood and beef products to have a extremely large market that they had historically been used to. But again, I want to stress that the initiative on critical minerals and the need to stabilize supply chains in critical minerals and across the board is a priority for Canada. And we are seen, further to the Davos speech that you mentioned, we are seen as a leader in terms of the global economy, in terms of ensuring that there's collaboration in multilateral institutions.
You mentioned you're headed to Munich for the security conference next week, I believe it is. You're also going to be headed to Greenland and Denmark to open consulates and as a show of sort of diplomatic support. What kind of a message do you hope, well, let's face it, countries like the United States take from these diplomatic moves you're making with our northern and NATO ally there?
A majority of countries with whom we speak are very much like-minded in the sense that we need to underscore the principles of state sovereignty and territorial integrity, and indeed the need for greater cooperation on Arctic security, including with the Nordic Five. And so while the formal opening of the consulate in Nuuk is part and parcel of our Arctic foreign policy, it goes without saying that the more than $80 billion that Canada is investing in defense and the Canadian Armed Forces is necessary to further bolster Canada's Arctic presence and the defense and security of our country in conjunction with Inuit and Indigenous peoples. I will say that our Arctic foreign policy also sees the opening of a consulate in Anchorage, which we will do later this year. And so the broad thrust is for Canada to have a greater physical presence in the Arctic, in Greenland, in Anchorage, and in the Canadian North, recognizing that 70% of our coastline and 40% of our landmass are Arctic facing.
Right. So Minister, just a final point. You're not the only Canadian member of Parliament who's in Washington, D.C. today. I mean, you're obviously there as the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Government of Canada. What do you make of Jamil Javani, the Conservative MP, going there to, I guess, use his personal connections to try to help on the trade file? The Prime Minister said today that, Mr. Javani got a brief. He's there. He's obviously not the Minister of Trade. He's not the Prime Minister. He thinks it's a little bit of an attention thing. How do you view it as a Minister of Foreign Affairs to have another MP there today?
MP Jamil Javani has not reached out to me personally. I am here, obviously, to build on the strong relationships that I have with Secretary Rubio and Ambassador Greer and others. And the work that we are doing across these files, including on critical minerals and the economic relationship, broadly speaking, is complex and involves numerous individuals on our respective teams who have been engaged for months and months and months. The process of negotiation means that we are exploring ways in which we can maximize Canada's interests with our counterparts on the other side of the border. This is, again, a very intense and complex process, and I'm honored to be at the table to lead on some of this work with my colleague, Minister LeBlanc, to ensure that Canada's interests are maximized at every turn.
Anita Anand, Minister of Foreign Affairs, we appreciate you squeezing us in on a busy travel day. Safe travels, and thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much.